we begin, ask yourself this: how many women in history were called mad? Just for being different? For being too emotional, too outspoken, too intelligent? What if I told you that some of them were locked away, not in dungeons, but in the attics of America's finest homes, forgotten by society, erased by their own families? If this side of history intrigues you, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to open doors that were never meant to be unlocked. There's something uniquely chilling about silence when it surrounds a life once filled with laughter, rebellion, or even grief. In the dim upper rooms of 19th century American mansions, behind false walls, locked trunks, and soundproof ceilings, lived women whose names never made it into the history books. Not because they had no story, but because their stories threatened the ones being told by men in parlors below. These were the women labeled mad. But madness, as it turned out, often meant little more than being inconvenient. Imagine a woman, let's call her Lillian, the daughter of a prominent New England industrialist. She spoke French, played Beethoven from memory, and once published a poem that hinted at melancholy, passion, and sexual longing. One autumn morning, after a small gathering, Lillian fainted in front of a group of men, one of them, a suitor she had refused. Within a week, she vanished from public view. The official story: she'd gone to stay with relatives. The truth? She was upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, her corset and shoes taken away, diagnosed by a family physician with hysteria and moral derangement. The attic was colder than her old room. Its windows had been nailed shut, and the wallpaper was damp with age. She wasn't allowed pens or books, only religious pamphlets and a wooden cross. Meals were left outside the door. No mirrors, no visitors. She was 26. She would die there before her 30th birthday. Lillian was not unique. In fact, she was part of a pattern that stretched across centuries and continents, but found a particularly haunting expression in 19th century America. This was a time when the ideal woman was demure, obedient, spiritually pure, and most of all, silent. If she wept too much after childbirth, it was madness. If she questioned her husband's authority, it was rebellion. If she loved another woman, it was perversion. The asylum became a convenient answer. Or, if the family was wealthy enough, the attic. In asylums like the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum in New York, or the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, women were institutionalized for everything from menstrual mania to novel reading. Doctors, overwhelmingly male, published long treatises about the danger of women's overstimulated imaginations. One even warned that reading too many romantic novels could cause uterine fury and permanent insanity. These ideas weren't fringe, they were medical consensus. Women were sometimes committed by their husbands with little more than a signed letter. In fact, in some states, a man could have his wife declared insane simply by swearing she'd become erratic or morally loose. No second opinion, no legal protection. Once institutionalized, the women lost all rights to vote, to own property, to parent their children, even to refuse experimental treatment. And treatments were often cruel: ice baths, purgatives, restraints, isolation. Some women were subjected to clitoridectomies or shock therapy. Others were kept sedated for years. But the attic stories are perhaps even more horrifying because they were more personal. They didn't happen in the cold sterility of state facilities, but inside homes, within the very walls of family and familiarity. One documented case from 1872 in Boston describes a young woman who had been kept hidden in her family's third floor for over a decade. When authorities discovered her, she could barely speak. She was half blind, covered in sores, and had developed a strange habit of mumbling her own name over and over again. Her crime? Falling in love with a Catholic man when her family was Protestant. Sometimes these women were not hidden because they were difficult, but simply because they were inconvenient. A spinster aunt with too much curiosity, a daughter with epilepsy, which was often misunderstood as a mental disorder, a girl who survived sexual assault but became emotionally unstable afterward. Rather than support or justice, these women were met with fear, shame, and secrecy. Even literature reflected this quiet horror. Think of Bertha Mason, the so-called madwoman in the attic, from Jane Eyre, hidden away by her husband, branded a danger, reduced to an animal. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper was based on her own harrowing experience with a rest cure, where she was forbidden to write, think, or speak about anything intellectual for months. Her protagonist's descent into madness wasn't the result of insanity. It was the result of isolation, suppression, and the denial of her mind's worth. In real life, some women fought back. Elizabeth Packard was institutionalized by her husband for religious disagreements and managed to secure her release after years of struggle. She then became an activist, pushing for reform in how women could be committed. Her voice was rare. Most women never made it out. Most names have been lost, but their shadows remain. Sometimes, during renovations of old homes, contractors find strange drawings beneath attic floorboards. Childlike etchings, scribbled prayers, scratch marks near windows. A name etched into a windowsill, repeated dozens of times, like a woman trying to remind the world that she had once existed. These are the whispers of history, and we must listen. So when we walk through historic house tours and admire the period furniture and ornate wallpaper, let's also ask, who lived upstairs? Who was kept from view? Whose story never made it into the tour guide brochure? Because the story of America's forgotten madwomen isn't just about madness. It's about silence, power, control, and the cost of being different in a world that demanded conformity. Their legacy haunts our architecture, our medicine, and our definitions of sanity. And we are only just beginning to listen. Not the terrifying gothic fiction of movies, but the very real, tax-funded, marble-floored, barred-windowed institutions meant to fix women who didn't fit. And here's the truth. They weren't hidden underground. They were built on hills. Proudly, publicly, with names like State Hospital for the Insane or Institute for the Feeble-Minded. Facilities that were, to the American public, modern marvels of morality and medicine. But behind those sanitized names? Hell. Consider the case of Utica State Hospital, opened in 1843. On its brochures, it was a temple of healing. But its infamous Utica crib, a coffin-like wooden box used to restrain agitated women, became a symbol of silent suffering. Women weren't restrained because they posed danger to others.
Subscribe to
They were
my channel.
restrained for crying too loudly, speaking without permission, resisting advances, or pacing at night. This, doctor said, was restorative. In Bloomingdale Asylum, wealthy women were kept on sunlit upper floors, where servants wheeled them through gardens. Poorer women were confined to dank basement wards, many misdiagnosed with chronic hysteria, simply because they were immigrants who spoke little English. In fact, one Irish woman was labeled insane for claiming her dead husband still visited her. No one checked her records. Her husband was alive. She was mourning from exile, not madness. But the most disturbing stories aren't always from the asylum's basements. Sometimes they're found in their paper trails. A 17-year-old girl from Pennsylvania committed in 1879 for religious melancholia. What caused it? Her brother had died of tuberculosis. She stopped attending church, then began writing poetry about death. Her family grew uncomfortable. Instead of grief counseling, which didn't yet exist, she was locked away. Over the next 12 years, her medical records show steady notes: refuses to eat, withdrawn, unresponsive, Eventually, one final note: no improvement. Condition chronic. Unlikely to marry. That was her end. Not with a scream, but with a line in a file folder. Doctors at the time genuinely believed they were doing good, that they were preserving the social order. Medical journals published advice on how to spot signs of incipient female lunacy, including daydreaming, masturbating, reading too many novels, or having a sarcastic manner. They prescribed ice-cold enemas, acid tonics, bleeding, electric shocks, sometimes even surgical removal of the uterus, under the theory that the womb was the source of female instability. These treatments didn't cure. They broke people. But not all women gave in. Take Nellie Bly, the pioneering journalist who faked insanity to get inside the Blackwell's Island Asylum in New York in 1887. What she found there shocked the nation. Women with no signs of mental illness kept in freezing rooms, beaten by staff, fed rotten food, and ignored when they cried out. Bly's report, 10 Days in a Madhouse, sparked outrage and reform. But not closure. The conditions continued for decades. Bly had simply pulled back the curtain. Other women weren't journalists. They were simply survivors. Dorothea Dix, for example, began as a quiet schoolteacher. But after visiting a jail where mentally ill women were chained in cages next to criminals, she launched a national crusade for better treatment. She toured hundreds of institutions, wrote detailed reports, and lobbied lawmakers. Because of her, over 30 mental hospitals were built. But even she, reformer as she was, couldn't see the full picture, that many women weren't ill at all, just unwanted. This brings us to an ugly truth. Many American families used asylums the way they used attics, to hide shame. A daughter who became pregnant out of wedlock, a wife who stopped attending church, a sister who whispered that she liked women. These were social threats in a society obsessed with reputation. Better to declare her mad than risk public scandal. And so the system grew. Between 1850 and 1900, the number of asylums exploded. Women were admitted for things like nervous temperament, uterine derangement, and disobedience. Once inside, they rarely came out. Records were sealed. Gravestones, when they existed, listed only numbers. In 1892, a Chicago woman was declared insane for requesting a divorce from her husband, who had repeatedly beaten her. The judge, a family friend of her in-laws, signed the commitment order. When found 5 years later by a distant cousin, she had lost most of her teeth, weighed under 80 pounds, and spoke in fragments. Her crime had been self-preservation. Not every addict was physical. Some were metaphorical, emotional cages crafted by social rules. Women who dared to think, to read, to dream were told to suppress themselves. And if they couldn't, they were locked away in institutions, in marriages, in bodies made numb by laudanum and tonics. Even education was weaponized. One Harvard doctor warned that too much schooling diverted blood from the uterus to the brain, rendering women infertile and unfit for domestic life. We look back at these claims and laugh, but they were deadly serious, and they shaped laws, treatments, and lives. Even the architecture of asylums tells a story. Many were designed in the Kirkbride plan, long hallways with wings, organized by severity. But within that severity was bias. Quiet, compliant women were placed near exits. Defiant women, even if sane, were pushed farthest away, in isolation. Noise, resistance, opinion, these were not signs of humanity, they were signs of danger. And yet, within these cold corridors, resistance burned quietly. Smuggled notes, eyelids fluttering at the sound of music, stories whispered through pipes. There are reports of patients creating Madwomen newspapers. Pages of secret writing passed between beds, filled with poetry, dreams, and coded warnings. Even broken, these women spoke. And we are just beginning to listen. Because the story of America's forgotten madwomen isn't only about pain, it's about survival. About voices that found ways to echo across decades, through scars, stories, and even silence. They remind us that the definition of madness is not fixed. It's political. It's cultural. It's deeply gendered. Some were mad. Most were not. But all deserve to be seen. We often imagine history as grand battles, great men, and noble causes. But beneath those headlines lived women whose only crime was not fitting the mold. They were not mad. They were inconvenient. And for that, they were hidden, silenced, or erased. But history has cracks. And through those cracks, their voices are still slipping through. If you stayed with me through this journey, through attics, asylums, and buried truths, then you've helped bring light to a part of the past long kept in the shadows. Their stories weren't supposed to survive, but now you know them. If you want to keep uncovering the histories that were never meant to be told, the hidden, the uncomfortable, the human, then subscribe, share, and join me next time. Because the past is full of whispers, and we're here to listen.